It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. So let me tell you a little bit first about the agency of which she is the first, what are you, president or director of the UU College of Social Justice. It was launched only in June of 2012, so it's not even 2 years old. As a joint collaboration of the UUA and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, its mission is to help Unitarian Universalists deepen and sustain the work of justice in their congregations and communities. They do this through experiential learning. There are programs that help people cross boundaries, gain insight, and imagine new ways to bring their faith together with their yearning to make a difference in the world. Just like Kent said, not coming down off the wall. The college offers this journeys and social justice training grounded in our faith's historic commitment to human rights, and it offers participants intensive engagement with justice work, along with the tools they need to bring that experience home again. Now, with Reverend Kathleen McTigue, before she joined the UUCSJ, not UUSJ, she served for 25 years as a UU minister in the parish, with 21 of those years being at the Unitarian Society of New Haven, Connecticut, just up the road a piece. A core part of her ministries has been public advocacy and faith-based organizing for marriage equality, immigrant rights, economic justice, and peace. Her previous experience also had multiple roles with Witness for Peace. She did a year-long economic study in Tanzania, and she earned a master's degree in divinity from Starr King School for the ministry and a bachelor's in economics from Stanford University. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Reverend Kathleen McTigue.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me here with you today. I'm glad to see so many of you taking time out from your lives to gather together, be here. Before I begin, I would actually like to take us back 10 minutes or so to the quiet mind place that I think our worship left us. It was a really grand place to start, and I'm very grateful to Kent and Daniel for kind of giving you my whole keynote, but in the form of a worship service. So I want to invite you actually into a moment of silence, something we still don't do nearly often enough, in my personal opinion. And I'll let you follow the sound of the meditation bell into that silence. So I just invite you to settle your mind. Reverend Gary Kowalski wrote these words about a common theme in our lives. Ever since I graduated from college, I have had a recurring dream in which it is time to take an exam and I am unprepared. I have not gone to classes all semester. I failed to do the reading. Usually I am even a little confused about the subject matter. What was being taught? Who was teaching? What was I supposed to learn? With a sense of approaching catastrophe, I realize that although I am about to be tested, I haven't a clue how to pass. What is the meaning of this peculiar dream? He goes on to ask. I think it is a dream about the great exam that each of us must face. The items on the exam are the ultimate questions. Who am I? What am I afraid of? To whom or what am I committed? What is my own highest good calling me toward? This is not just a dream about academic anxieties or forgetting the dates of the Magna Carta. It is about forgetting our own reason for being. Now, it can be quite perilous to discuss one's dream life in a crowd of strangers, but I suspect I am not risking too much by telling you that I too have had this dream from time to time. The minister's version of it actually is walking into a crowded sanctuary just to enjoy worship and suddenly realizing in the dream, you're the preacher. You don't even know what congregation it is, much less what your topic is supposed to be. But how many of you have had some version of that dream? Sometime. I knew I wasn't risking much. So we sometimes know exactly why that dream shows up in its various manifestations. We've made some big change in our lives. We're stretching in a direction that we're a little afraid of, or we feel we might not quite be up to the challenge. And so we know why that dream has appeared on the dark screen of our psyche. But like Gary Kowalski, I have come to believe that there is also, nearly always, an existential reason why we have that dream. We know, deep down inside, even if we're not thinking about it consciously, that this class that is our lifetime is one we get to take only once, as far as we know, and there are no do-overs. So we find ourselves asking those deep existential questions, and if we're not asking them consciously, they will come up unconsciously. We know that we have to somehow find ourselves, shape ourselves to be of use in this world of ours. We have that hunger and that yearning. We have the inkling that our lives should be about something more than simply our own happiness or even our own goodness. And so we try hard to pay attention. But it seems that most of the time, for most of us, we're actually not paying too much attention to those grand, meaningful questions of our lives. No matter how well we try to keep ourselves awake against the distractions that fill our days, we do get distracted, sometimes for months or even years, away from those deep, large questions. And nevertheless, somewhere in our unconscious, some part of us is aware of that ticking clock of our mortality. And I think that's why that dream rises up for us from time to time. For those of us who care deeply about issues outside of our small personal sphere, particularly issues of social change, justice, and peace, those questions come up quite consciously and quite often. In one way or another, in looking at the profound suffering in the world around us, we find ourselves asking, with some anxiety, am I doing what I should be doing? Am I putting my gifts to work in the way that I ought to be? Is my life aligning with my values? Or is there something more to which I am called? So as we ask these questions of ourselves, although there are scores of different actions to which they might lead us, in general, the pathways we pursue in an attempt to answer these questions follow one of two large directions. Sometimes the questions propel us into a search for a deeper spiritual life. So we go looking for a community of worship that feels completely congruent with who we are. We adopt a new spiritual practice of prayer or meditation in an attempt to make ourselves more quiet or to deepen ourselves in directions like patience and compassion. We take ourselves off on a retreat or a pilgrimage in order to jumpstart a new level of awakening. Or sometimes our hunger for a more meaningful life takes us out into the world of action. We join a new coalition of some kind in our area, one that seems to really be building up a head of steam for being effective. We get mad enough at someone in office that we pour ourselves into an alternative candidate's campaign. We protest some new injustice. We get connected to a shelter or a soup kitchen and then find ways to lobby for care for the poor that treats people with dignity, no matter how much they have or how little. We try, in other words, to find some place to catch hold where there is traction and make some kind of difference toward justice in our world. When I was a young adult, just a few years out of college, it seemed to me perfectly evident that these two pathways were completely distinct from each other. They were both essential, at least to me, but I could not see any way in which they linked together. When I applied for admission to Starr King School for the ministry at the age of 27, I was trying hard to figure out how to balance the tug of those two different directions in my life and how to make sense of the parallel, but it seemed to me separate hungers that they both evoked in me. I had spent the previous 5 years immersed in social justice efforts in the San Francisco Bay Area where I lived, in a strong community of other young activists. I was not a Unitarian Universalist. I was an ex-Catholic, a new and tentative Buddhist, and a political anarchist. The distinctly odd choice of seminary way back then was prompted not by a vocational calling. In fact, I was quite sure I had no intention of ever entering the ministry. It was prompted instead by a profound spiritual hunger that I did not know how to feed. I was at that time living in this community of activists, and my spiritual hunger was something I had to view as completely separate from my life as an activist, because it was something that very few of my radical friends shared or even understood. I had no idea what to do with it, though I was quite sure it had nothing to do with church. So I learned to sit meditation, and I wrote endlessly in my journal as a spiritual practice because I felt like I couldn't take that part of my life into my community where it simply was not understood. Starr King, in that moment of my life, seemed, I am ashamed to say right now, like a low-risk option for me. You never know where things are going to lead. I was already living in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had a job that was flexible that I could hold on to. And by entering Starr King, I was able to take courses at all of the theological schools of the Graduate Theological Union. So I hoped that something there would help me feed my spiritual hunger, or would at least diminish it. Well, the answer for my conflict there did not actually arise at Starr King. It happened for me when I dropped out of seminary after my first year in order to go to Nicaragua and live and work with Witness for Peace. Witness for Peace was a faith-based organization, and I decided to go with them with a certain amount of fear and trembling because I wasn't a Christian and I was not sure whether or not I would feel alienated or included in this faith-based community. But I found in that group of people, both Nicaraguan and American, a deeply open-hearted faith community that would in some ways put our avowed inclusion in our churches to shame. In the companions that I found in the 6 months that I worked and lived in the war zones of Nicaragua, I encountered a radical practice of Christianity unlike anything that I had ever known before. My path was changed completely by those 6 months, immersed in that work and immersed in tumultuous, beautiful Nicaragua, so filled with violence and sacrifice. It was there that I came to know the power of collective action that is grounded not merely in political conviction, but in spiritual practice. I saw nonviolence enacted right in the jaws of a devastating war and therefore witnessed the shining seed of that satyagraha, that truth force that Gandhi talked about. It was there that I witnessed people who prayed together before making decisions or taking action, who prayed not just for the opportunity to act, but who prayed as well for the safety and wholeness of their adversaries. I saw the serenity, humility, and courage such a practice nourished in the otherwise chaotic, deadly setting of a war zone. And it was there that I got the first hint that maybe I was not, after all, done with church. Because the people who surrounded me were people who drew their life's guidance, sustenance, and inspiration from congregational gatherings. When I returned to the United States, I re-entered seminary, not as a progressive Christian, still very much as a seeker, but with a new openness to what I might find within Unitarian Universalism and even within ministry, because I had finally caught a glimpse of what it looks like when those two divergent-seeming pathways are actually brought together into deep, continuous conversation. Over the many years since then, I have heard lots of other people's stories about how they too first caught a glimpse of that linking of justice with spirituality. The stories differ, of course, from each other, but the insight that we gain from seeing that is the same. What we realize is that no matter how peaceful our minds and hearts may become from a spiritual practice, no matter how joyful and spirit-infused our congregational gatherings might be, without clear opportunities to put our hands to work in the world, all of that spiritual practice rings hollow. And on the other hand, we learn through immersion in secular political work how tempting it can be, how easy it can be to slide emotionally and mentally toward the entrapments of egotism, righteousness, and the kind of us against them mentality that in only a slightly different context can slip so easily toward violence. So there is this idea that we can bring together these two different paths and find ourselves in the matrix, the place where they meet, where spirituality and justice work are joined. The challenge, it seems to me, for us as Unitarian Universalists in our congregations is that not universally, but in many, many ways, and in, I would say, the majority of our congregations, we have grown so accustomed to, again, separating those two things. This is, of course, profoundly ironic. In the early days of our faith's time here in this country, the debate within our congregations would have been, is it appropriate to bring these issues of political stuff, like emancipation, for instance, into our communities of worship? Shouldn't we instead be about the business of praising God? Well, today, it seems to me, we have the exact opposite challenge. Is it appropriate to bring our spiritual selves out wholly with a W, into the public sphere, to speak out there from our faith? It has become a very commonplace statement for us to say, our communities of faith offer a place where you can walk in the door and you don't have to leave your intellect behind. However, as true as I think that statement is, we have often become communities of faith where we do have to leave behind our spirituality when we walk out those church doors to go engage in our justice work. Does this, just tell me, does this sound familiar? Yes. Just a little bit familiar in our congregations. All right, so what do we do about that? I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what I am hoping the College of Social Justice can help us do about it, although we are a very tiny slice of denominational life, and therefore it will take a great deal more than anything the UU College of Social Justice can offer to help us get over that hump. But I want to tell you a little bit about that and then talk a little bit about why I think it is so incredibly important that we reclaim our spiritual lives and our spiritual language when we are outside of our congregational settings. The mission of the College of Social Justice is a one-sentence mission. It is to inspire and sustain faith-based justice work on matters of local, national, and global importance. When I stepped into this job a year and a half ago, it was 2 paragraphs long, the statement of purpose, and I said, no, let's shrink this a little bit. And the glory of being the director of a startup is that I don't have a whole 200 or 300 people who have to agree on the statement of purpose. I can just kind of go, no, let's cross that out. Let's boil this down a little bit. So that's the mission statement, to inspire and sustain faith-based justice work on issues of local, national, and global importance. When I was first being asked to consider this job, and I was told that it was this new idea for how we might provide faith-based justice work for our people, I said, tell me what you mean by faith-based justice work. How many of you think I got an answer? I didn't get an answer. I mean, what I got was an intellectual concept that, well, we would create programs where people learned about UU history and how we had been engaged in social justice for all of our history and would be able to draw on the inspiration of that history and so forth. And I said, well, if I were the director, what I think I would mean by faith-based justice work is that we would find new ways to practice our faith, and that we would not only mean taking steps toward justice, that we would actually engage in contemplative practice together, for instance. So the people who were interviewing me said, yeah, that's what we meant. That's what we want. So I kind of got carte blanche to do what I want to do. And I believe, I hope, the experiment anyway, is that it is in fact responding to a deep, deep hunger in our congregations to find ways other than thinking about our faith to practice it. So I think what I'd like to do actually is point to the College of Social Justice and take you through a very brief PowerPoint that gives you some visuals about what it is we're trying to do, and then come back and talk a little bit more about that spiritual grounding that we are trying to infuse into our justice work. So, as you heard in the beginning, the College of Social Justice is a collaboration between the UUA and UUSC. This is the mission that I just told you about. It is important to recognize that a piece of what the college is designed to do is link together these 2 parent organizations. As many of you know, if you've been part of Unitarian Universalism for any length of time, you know there have been periods in our history when the 2 have not played nicely together. They are collaborating beautifully at the moment, and the College of Social Justice is one of the products of that collaboration, and truly is the most ambitious one in many years of our denominational history. The core method that we use is experiential learning. And so we create short-term journeys to global justice partners, intensive justice trainings, transformative summer college internships, and we're working on long-term skilled volunteer placements as well. And this is the key, all grounded in faith-based study and reflection. So learning about our denomination's history is in there, but that's not all that is in there. So what is that faith-based study and reflection? Before we went too much farther with creating programs for the College of Social Justice, we created a study guide which is on our website, available to anyone. You don't have to join a College of Social Justice program to take advantage of it. And that is an attempt to help people be better at boundary crossing. So what I mean by that is that the idea behind this study guide is that before you go to gritty working class Chicago on a program to understand about working justice, or Haiti on a program to understand land rights, you had better really begin by understanding yourself. And that includes understanding the lenses that you wear that have to do with privilege and power and being a North American. So that's what we are trying to help people do, but we are also, as you will see here, right at the top, trying to engage people in what it means to bring spiritual practice and social justice together. So that is a core part of what we are trying to bring into the programs in all ways. And I'll come back after I've finished showing you some slides to what that means to us. So just to give you a brief overview, we have 5 destinations right now for short-term immersion experiences. All of them are with justice partners of either the UUA or UUSC. We don't go out and make up a partnership, nor do we partner with any American NGO. All of the partners are grassroots, indigenous organizations to whatever place we travel. In Haiti, it's mostly land rights and farmer justice. In Chicago, it's worker justice, and particularly minimum wage and benefits for food chain workers. In India, it's land rights and gender justice with Holding in India partners. I'm sorry, the lights are making it hard to... Can you see these photos from where you are? Can we turn off the lights for just a minute? We didn't rehearse before, so sorry. All right, never mind. Just strain your eyes a little bit. They're actually great photos. I'm sorry that you can't see them so well. I don't know. Did that do anything? Oh, you turned off something over there. In Mississippi, I think those of you who were here last night to hear the wonderful music that Kim and Reggie Harris offered us, Reggie's on the board of the Living Legacy Project, which is our partner for the Mississippi Civil Rights Pilgrimage this coming summer, where we will link civil rights history with current-day voter suppression efforts. And that's for youth and adults, by the way. And in Mexico, with food and migration. We are also doing justice trainings for high school youth to help them imagine themselves as makers of justice as they begin to enter their adulthood. Last summer, and again this summer, we had trainings and will again in Boston. We had one and will again in New Orleans, and we have added one in Seattle this coming summer, as well as a one-day training at General Assembly. I don't know why this is not... Now, there we go. For some reason it's making me click now. Sorry, I'm not all that competent with technology. My clicker's not working now. All right, then the third large area that we're doing, that was short-term immersion learning, the youth justice trainings. The third area is young adult global internships, primarily aimed at college-age young adults. These were the 9 young adults that we were able to place last year, and we have 23 this coming summer. We are really excited about this. About 2/3 of them will be within the United States with justice partners, and the other third will be overseas. And the beauty of catching this age group, this college age group, is that these are people who are deeply involved in that question, what am I to do with my life? And we are trying to catch them at that cusp of vocational discernment and give them some answers that might work for them when it comes to justice work. And in 2015, we will be offering something akin to the internships, but stay tuned. Those of you who are in or near retirement, these programs are for you. We would like to create opportunities for people who are highly skilled in their own vocational lives, who have now the time and the energy to give for a month, 3 months, possibly even 6 months, to partners overseas or in the United States. And that's Dr. Seuss. I hope you can read it. Sort of the underlying philosophy, despite all the other things that I say. We want you to start happening. So here are a couple of other things I want to say, and then I'm actually going to invite your own reflections, both to each other and back to me. Beneath the programs that the College of Social Justice has created is this idea that there should be ways to live at the matrix of our spiritual lives and our justice work. And we think that there are two ways that the college can develop, at least, that will help us to do that better. The first is creating programs that push us to see and then to cross our boundaries. And the second is to ground the things we do in contemplative practices, both individually and as small groups. So the boundary crossing piece of this is what I referenced a little while ago. You know, there are lots of ways that experiential learning can be understood. The short-term language that is often used is a service learning trip, because people tend to understand what that means, a service learning trip. We're actually trying to get away from that language because of the pitfalls that are often involved when people from the United States go to a developing country on a service learning trip. There are many, many pitfalls that have to do with top-down orientation and being the great white hope and things like that. But also because we recognize that the service that we can do is not in Haiti. It is not even in Chicago with rock or in New Orleans. The service we do is right where we live. So the idea is to give people a profound experience of what it means to push past your own boundaries. When you do it externally, you often begin to see them internally as well, so that you are better empowered to do boundary-crossing kinds of social justice when you come back to your own home territory. I'd like to give you an example of how that can work. How many of you, because I know some of you were there, were at the Moral March in Raleigh, North Carolina in February? Hands? A few hands anyway. How many of you knew about it? Okay, so almost all of you at least knew about it. One of the people who is involved in the Moral Mondays work there is Jay Leach, who serves our congregation in Charlotte, North Carolina. Jay came with the College of Social Justice on an experience in India in 2012. And it was after that that he got involved in the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina. Now, any of you who know Jay know that he has been a political activist, a deeply caring, spiritually grounded political activist for a very long time. The journey to India did not wake him up to his urge to be of use in the world or to do social justice. But it gave him an experience of boundary crossing, of seeing how people in India were literally risking their lives for some of the rights we take for granted. It gave him an experience of seeing leadership completely from the grassroots up. And what he says that did for him when he joined the Moral Monday March was open his mind and heart to accepting the leadership of the NAACP. Now, it's not because he was in any way hostile to the NAACP, but we Unitarian Universalists are very used to leading the charge, aren't we? We very often ask the question, this is a terrible injustice in my area. What shall I do? Or better, what shall we do to respond to it? It is less common that we ask the question, who is already working on this issue? Who is it who, from the margins, who is oppressed by that very injustice, is already out there doing this work? How shall we become allies to them? How shall we walk in solidarity with them? Now, my friends, for Unitarian Universalists, that is a boundary-crossing thing to ask. Because what it means is we will put ourselves in a position of serving a cause, walking with and in solidarity with people who are being directly marginalized by injustice, and we may very well not be the leaders. That is an uncomfortable place for us to stand. And I would suggest to you that if we don't learn to stand there, to walk there, we will become profoundly irrelevant in the multicultural world that we inhabit. The other thing that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, the other piece that the college is trying to create for us, in addition to these experiences of boundary crossing, is why I think it is so important for us to learn to practice our faith in the form of contemplative practices. Now, you all know, because you're smart people and because many of you have already engaged these practices, the vast range that they cover. There are many different forms of prayer, many different forms of meditation, lots of embodied practices like yoga or Tai Chi. They have a few central things in common if they are a spiritual practice. They are intentional, meaning we don't just stumble into being quiet. We intend to sit down and practice making our minds more quiet. They're intentional. They are attentional. That is, they are geared toward helping us pay close attention to what is right in front of us. There's a reason we try to quiet the busy, chattery mind. It's so that we can be more receptive to what is actually here, instead of just paying attention to our stories about what is actually here. And the third thing they have in common is that they are repeated, that we do them again and again, so that we can kind of build them up to being a habitual way of life. So here are the reasons why I think these practices are so important to practice both as individuals and in our small groupings. First, because they help us touch what is transcendent. We touch it in lots of ways, really, sometimes quite accidentally. A moment just catches us and we're swept up. We catch it sometimes in our worship gatherings, with music, for instance, or with the time of silence, or with that magical chemistry that happens when the music and the poetry and the prayer and the sermon all come together into something bigger than the sum of its parts. And we can touch it when we practice together outside of worship as well. Abraham Joshua Heschel once said, "Living is not a private affair of the individual. Living is what we do with God's time, what we do with God's world." Now, I invite you not to trip over your own theology and recognize that what he is actually saying can be said in any theological language. The beauty of contemplative practices is that they help ground us in that which is larger than ourselves. However muddled we might be about God, these practices help us remember that we ourselves are not God. They connect us to that vast unfolding of which all our best efforts are one small but essential part. Secondly, these practices help us to pay attention to what is. If you sit in a small group of people and you practice deep silence together, not for 30 seconds, for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes even, watching your sweet breath rise and fall, feeling your heartbeat, recognizing you're alive on planet Earth, which we often don't take time to realize. I promise you, you will hear what your companions have to say differently when you enter the meeting part of that gathering. You yourself will bring forward something more deeply attentive. And if you learn to practice that way, when you find yourselves on a profoundly boundary-crossing journey to India, to Haiti, to Chicago, you will be newly open to something coming toward you that you might not have perceived if you had not practiced being quiet enough. There's a marvelous phrase that I found once in an essay by a guy named House, John House, when he was writing about, of all things, orangutans. What he started to describe in this essay was the fact that in order to conserve their precious energy, living as they do in a rainforest environment, orangutans have adopted this odd practice of searching for food. They sit on a branch, completely still, and stare off into the canopy until, in House's words, the desired delicacy announces itself to their gaze. Isn't that a marvelous phrase? Announces itself to their gaze. He goes on to say, if in their normal pace of things, they can't see the food that they're looking for because there is so much around them, all of those leaves, all those flowers, all those fruits and nuts of different kinds. It's only when they quiet down enough that they can see the thing that they're actually hoping for. When we, close cousins to the orangutans, find ways to be still and attentive enough, we will find that for us too, parts of our reality that we are otherwise too busy and too occupied to see will announce themselves to our gaze. Third, our spiritual practices help us notice the emotional and even spiritual channels that we have tuned into, and to change the channel when it is necessary. Now, what I mean by that is something you are all profoundly familiar with. You wake up some morning, and for no particularly good reason, you're just crabby as all hell. And you move through your day that way, because that's just how you're feeling. It actually doesn't have to be that way. We can stop and calm down and pay attention to that channel and recognize that we have the power to change the channel. Not to say that that feeling goes away, but that we can make a deliberate choice to act out of a different impulse. Some months ago, in the middle of the winter, I made a trip from Boston to New York, and as I try to do when I have to make that trip, I traveled by train. It is, to my mind, a lovely, relaxing train journey because, first of all, of course, you can read or do whatever you want on the train. You're not driving. But also because the train goes down along and back up along the coast for the whole time. So on the one hand, you're passing through all of these different manifestations of human development, through these little working-class neighborhoods and gritty kind of warehouse areas with red brick and broken windows. And suddenly, there are these waterside mansions you're going past, little hamlets and so forth, and all the time woven through are these forests or little forested areas with water of all kinds, inlets and bays and saltwater marshes and ponds and streams. So looking out the window can be very pleasurable as you're on this train ride. So this particular time, I was coming back up to Boston from some time in New York City, and I couldn't get on the quiet car, which I always try to do. So I was stuck on the car where it's okay to talk on your cell phone. And this guy behind me, this young man behind me, was yakking on his cell phone. And after about 10 minutes after the train had left the station, he was finally wrapping it up. Now, this was winter, remember, and it was very gray, and the rain was falling down. And as he wrapped up his phone call, he said, oh, God, it's turned into such a disgusting day. It's dark, pouring rain, there's fog everywhere. It's supposed to get even colder tomorrow. God, I hate New England. And that was the end of that phone call. 2 minutes later, from several seats up in front of me where I couldn't see who it was, someone's cell phone rang. And I heard a man's voice say hello, and then there was a long pause, and then he said, oh, I'm great. It is a beautiful day. There's this soft rain falling outside, and this fog is drifting through the trees. It is just stunning. What a treat. One reality. Two completely different stories. Spiritual practice is called practice because that's what we do with it. We practice. And over time, it can help us tilt toward the channels we actually want to be tuned into, toward being the person who can greet the rain or whatever else it might be and say, what a treat. Fourth, our contemplative practices together, particularly when we are in small groupings intending to engage in justice work. Our contemplative practices together help us remember that the things that need to be changed out there in the world exist in one form or another within us as well. They help us remember that we are not merely about changing the world, that we also must be open to being changed ourselves. There's this marvelous Kabir poem in which he writes, I don't know what sort of a God we have been talking about. The caller calls out in a loud voice to the Holy One at dusk. Why? Surely the Holy One is not deaf. He hears the delicate anklets that ring on the feet of an insect as it walks. Go over and over your beads, paint weird designs on your forehead, wear your hair matted, long, and ostentatious. But when deep inside you there is a loaded gun, how can you have God? When deep inside us there is a loaded gun, how can we have God? Or to put it more broadly, if deep inside us we are seething with anger, how shall we be peacemakers? If deep inside us there are the seeds of greed taking root, how will we shift the grotesque chasm between the rich and the poor? Spiritual practices keep us honest, mindful of the fact that the changes we're trying to work for out there also need to be made manifest within us. And finally, and I think this is a part we actually know about spiritual practices, they sustain us for the long haul. Each time we give ourselves the chance to touch into the deep well of spiritual nurture, we find a kind of rest that is not the same as just sitting down to rest or going to sleep. It is not because the feelings that we bring with us from our engaged work in the world go away. The despair, the hopelessness, the frustration, the indignation on the part of those who suffer, all of those things come with us, are brought with us into the circle of our spiritual practice. But there's a marvelous analogy for this that is used by Buddhism. Imagine a glass of water that is terribly, terribly salty. It is not possible to drink it. It is intolerable to drink it. Imagine that salty glass of water as all of those feelings that are generated by our attempts to help, to heal the world. The despair, the hopelessness, the fear, all those things. If you take that glass of water and pour it into a clear lake, all of the salt is still there, but it's bearable. The water can now be drunk because you can see that that pain that we bring forward, that pain in which we are engaging in our justice struggles, is part of this much larger thing. That's where we rest, seeing that as where we are truly lodged. So our spiritual grounding in all of these ways is where we get to tap again into hope. We remember all of those who taught compassion, all who have acted for justice. We remember that we are part of their lives and they part of us. We remember the long arc of which our efforts are just one very small part. And we thereby find ways to keep our despair in a larger context and then carry hope with us back out into a world that is always broken and always healing. Now, I've talked for a long time, and so I would like to invite you to enter again into a moment of silence with me. And then for the time remaining to us, I am very interested in hearing your own reflections on how the things I've lifted up might fit into the spiritual context in which you live, your own congregations. Let's hold a moment of silence. This will be a short one, but still it helps. I invite your reflections. And I'll repeat what you say from here so that those who may not be able to hear you can hear me anyway.
I would welcome your reflections on the role of grief in the crossing of the boundaries.
Say that again, on the role of grief. I can tell you what I think you mean, but why don't you tell me what you mean? Do you have something particular in mind?
When we wake up, we lose a dream.
When we wake up, we lose a dream.
Does it not need to be mourned?
Well, I guess what I would say is in the same way that we can bring forward our despair into a spiritual practice, the idea is that that holds all of who we are, that we can bring forth joy as well as grief, and can find ourselves held and nurtured there, which is, I think, what we also hope for from our communities of faith, from our congregations. But I will also add that in the context in which I now work, in the College of Social Justice, a part of what happens when you go to some of these places where the work of justice is being engaged in such enormously difficult circumstances is a terrible level of grief. Because the enormity of the suffering is brought home in such a vivid way. And we know we are going home to a place where we're not suffering in that same way. And so it is both the grief on behalf of those we are meeting as companions, and it's grief about the disconnect, the gulf between where we live and work and where these people are suffering. One of the things that we try to help people prepare for in that is the power of what it means to bear witness. Because what we often do, I think, in the face of grief or guilt, or some of those other very uncomfortable feelings, is try to leap into solution. Honestly, because it makes us feel better. It calms our own feelings. So what we actually try to help people do is stay in that place of grief, rather than immediately find ways to ameliorate it. Because that's the reality. And it is from that part of reality that our better plans for how to act, our better methods of being in solidarity will arise. If we try to leap over it into a solution that calms the feeling, that's when we're most often not actually standing in solidarity. We're playing fix-it. And we're trying very hard to help people not do that. Yes?
I think what you said absolutely resonates with every one of us, because it's talking about what is the motive, first of all, for being out there, so to speak. And secondly, where do you get the energy to keep going when things don't go well, which is pretty much most of the time.
Right.
But what we talk about as a faith-based motive then gets a little uncomfortable in one sense, because there are people who claim the same motive, who have completely different objectives. Their objectives would be to defeat marriage equality. Their objectives would be to essentially enslave people,
Right.
ideologically and politically and economically and so forth. And they claim to do so on the basis of their faith.
Right.
And so I just wanted you to address that.
So for those of you who couldn't necessarily hear all of this, what's your name?
Jerry.
Jerry. What Jerry said is that the ideas resonate, the idea of finding our sustenance and doing spiritual practice, but that it feels complicated to go out there in the public sphere and speak from a position of faith, because there are others out there speaking from a position of faith who are on the exact opposite side of the issue from us, who want to, in your words, enslave people, keep gay, lesbian, bi, and trans people closeted or eliminated even from the world, and so forth. So what I would say is, yes, all the more reason why we need to speak from our faith. I actually had many more things to say here than I had time for, so I didn't say them all, but as it happens, I have a perfect quote here from Paul Razor, who some of you have read, who wrote a little book recently about the critical importance of liberals reclaiming religious language in the public sphere. And what he says is, if our religion plays a significant role in our lives, then it must do more than simply reinforce the values of our culture. In fact, our values are often deeply countercultural. So given the public dominance of conservative religious voices today, if religious liberals don't speak up from their faith, no one else will know there is another religious perspective. So, for instance, in the example of gay and lesbian, bisexual, and trans rights, if we are simply out there in the secular world advocating because we're in favor of human rights, Our voices truly do not carry the same resonant power as if we are able to say something akin to, we are all children of God. We live, work, and are often served by GLBT people. We know them. They are us, and we are them. There is no separation here. And as people of faith, we will not step down. That is speaking from our own faith conviction, right? The other thing I want to say about that is that for more than a generation, I would say for at least 50 years, partly out of fear of our religious diversity in our communities, where we somehow became afraid of offending one another, we stopped speaking religiously at all. So because we know, let's say you're a congregation, because I know there are some of you in this congregation who don't like the word God, I stop using it. Instead of trusting that you, as a mature human being committed to religious diversity, can translate my language into your language. So we practice suppression of the religious language in our own congregations, and therefore we're handicapped when we go out into the world. We don't know how to use that language. And the effect of that is it has taken us out of the religious conversation. Instead of being able to sit around that ecumenical or interfaith roundtable with people who have something to say from our faith, we stand over against the wall as though we're just watching the religious people have the conversation. People, that's not okay. Our faith has something to say in that conversation, and we've got to use religious language to be in the religious conversation. One here first, and then there.
Can I just offer a tool?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I'll give you that. So, my minister, I'm a member of... Oh, should I do this? Okay. My minister, Nancy McDonald Ladd, whom some of you might know, I'm a lifelong member of River Road, said in a service, Nancy uses God. She uses God a lot. And in our church, we've been a bit God allergic.
It's
been
a change.
It's been a change.
What
she said is, listen, if that makes you uncomfortable, think about the folks in your congregation and in your family sitting next to you who might feel that hearing God reclaimed from a liberal pulpit is saving them, who might feel that, in fact, that's not, who might feel that language is making space again in religion for them. So for any of you who preach, I just want to offer that. And
thank you.
Good luck.
There was a hand in the middle over here. Words are vastly important, and the little tiny words of religious language like God point to these vast realities.
And they're used on, as the gentleman said, used on both sides of the political, social, perspective.
Right.
And so what I would love to see these kinds of meetings be about, at the district level, at the UUA level, is our language.
Right.
What is our language? And we're going to lose people because our language isn't going to be as inclusive. But if we don't get our language, we will never have our voice. And if we don't have our voice, we're going to be going like this at a time in terms of people, in terms of our influence, in terms of what we're doing. If we don't find our voice and articulate, just as you
So here's the answer that I would give to this. I served UU congregations for 25 years, and I'm still obviously operating completely within the Unitarian Universalist family, the fold. So I know very well the allergic reaction that many people have to certain kinds of language, especially old language, God language. What I would suggest is that we have not always done the work we need to do in figuring out our own triggers and our own reactivity, and in learning together what inclusivity actually means. And a term that I came to use in my own congregation, because I stepped into a congregation that had been founded in the heyday of humanism, that was really, I had people in my face after every sermon in the beginning when I was newly there, when I would use religious language of almost any kind. Spirit, prayer, sin, salvation, repentance, God, the whole thing, the whole bailiwick. But I think over time people learned to think differently about the promise of our faith. I do not believe we're ever going to have a religious language we all vote on and agree on or have consensus around. Am I right about this? But I do think we can come to agreement rather quickly on what it means to be religiously tolerant. And it doesn't mean this. All right, tell me what you believe. It means glad curiosity. Glad curiosity is what our religious tolerance asks of us. And to me, what that might mean in the kinds of circles of spiritual grounding that I'm hypothesizing before we go out and do action in the world and so forth, is that within those safe circles where we can hold silence together, it doesn't require any language, where we can invite one another to pray in whatever language is right for me, if it's my turn to pray, and you will translate because you are my companion on this journey. We will be practicing glad curiosity, which is real tolerance. And we will therefore be able to speak a spiritual language in the public sphere. And it does not all have to be the same language. But I would suggest to you that we will never learn to cross boundaries effectively in the incredibly critical work that we must do, like what's going on in North Carolina, led by black Christian ministers. If we cannot find some way to stand with those who pray, not only to God, but in the name of Jesus Christ, without flinching. We need to be in this struggle with these sisters and brothers of ours, and we need to not let our religious language be the barrier. Are we done? Okay.